trying to do the math, over 10 years now. Okay, there we go. We got the recorded. All right. So for over 10 years now, and right now I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Women's and Gender Studies and Africana Studies, affiliated faculty at the University of Toledo. And I help, a co-PI on their Health Humanities grant. And that's been my area of focus in this research area, has been trying to understand those connections between medical history of slavery in relation to the development of modern gynecology, but also the cultural memory aspects of it. So what happened versus how we talk about it and how we remember it. And there tends to be always a tension between history and cultural memory that we have to negotiate through continuous conversations and protests and activism and scholarship. So that's been my interest area, is particularly looking at not only the medical history aspects of it, but also particularly how the foremothers of modern American gynecology have been remembered in Black feminist practice, particularly Black feminist art, scholarship, and activism. And so that's what I'll sort of anchor us in now, because I think it provides a good segue into going back into history of sort of what is going on now in this area, on the ground, in Black feminist scholarship and in art activism. And how does that relate to reproductive justice, Black women's maternal health now, and these bigger questions, and questions around the meaning of monument culture and cultural memory, as that tends to be an area, or has become an area recently, where we're having these public negotiations about the meaning of the past. So with that, I'm truly delighted to be here with you. And Jaleesa, I don't know if you can pull up, if you've been able to pull up the slides yet.
So it's asking me to sign into the University of Toledo's
Yes.
Microsoft Office.
Okay, hold on one second. Let me put it as a, let me download it as a PDF.
Thank you.
All right. It's really good too, y'all. Just, it's gonna be worth the wait, because I think this is a story that's best told visually. And so I have a lot of that visual imagery that I think will be really useful to our discussion today. Okay. Try this one more time. Okay. Okay. Let me look for, that's so weird. Okay, I just attached it as a copy, so that should work. We have an internal system here at U Toledo that requires you to sign into the network, but let me know if that works. If not, I'm happy to just talk everybody through it. So what I started with is, there are a couple of iconographic images in relation to this history that, if you're familiar enough, that many people have seen. The first one actually comes from a portrait that was done in the 50s called Great Moments in Medical History. And it depicts, in some interesting ways, it depicts a scene where there is a Black enslaved woman on a medical table, on an exam table, and she's being looked at by one James Marion Sims. And we have other white male medical men in the room, There it is. So that's what we start with. And that's a close in. We believe that that probably is depicting Betsy. What you can see in the full image, though, is that there are other enslaved women peering from behind that curtain. There are a couple of aspects of this representation that Black feminist historians and scholars have pushed back against. One is that the enslaved women would not have been given the benefit of propriety in most cases. And so, no sheet, they probably would have been nude. And the power differentials there. So we're going to hold this image in one part of our minds, but we're going to keep in mind that this is what Black feminism has been pushing back against and fighting back against and speaking back against for decades now. And I start that start point in 1985 with the development of sort of Black feminist second wave feminist perspectives, as well as Africana studies perspectives. And so we have been pushing back for a long time against this representation of Sims, who's become symbolic of the father of so-called father of modern gynecology, even though Dr. Cooper Owens gives us a broader context for how many physicians there were and other physicians that worked. Sims sort of becomes the placeholder for all of them. So he's a stand-in as a representative of sort of white masculine medicine in the 19th century in relation to the development of gynecology. So we can go to the next slide, where I sort of break down how my research, again, intersects with that of Dr. Cooper Owens. So she is an esteemed and highly awarded medical historian. And I'm interested in that too. And I'm interested in that from Black feminist perspectives, but particularly looking at not just what happened, but also how it has come to matter in the 21st century context, and how Black feminists, scholars, artists, and grassroots activists have sort of approached this history in the 21st century. Why it continues to resonate is something that's been fascinating to me. Even at looking at it at over 10 years, it continues to resonate with different knowledge communities. So this, again, is the intersection between the medical history, a lot of which we'll dig into in the conversation today, and the cultural memory of it. So what happened versus how we remember it and how we negotiate and make meaning over the past. Black feminism has been particularly interested in naming the enslaved women to the extent that we can know them. Three of those names we are familiar with are Anarcha, Lucy, and Betsy. The first names that appear in the life writing of Dr. James Marion Sims, which actually was published after he passed and revised by his son in 1888. He only mentions three of those women by their first names, and there's been some research on that area about the politics of naming and slavery, and the last names of the women potentially. So we'll come back to that in a little bit. But those are three of the names we know. Many of the names we don't know. And so again, these three women have become symbolic of larger histories of voiceless enslaved people who were experimented on in medical histories, and certainly in gynecology, but even more broadly in medical research in the 19th century. So leading to the development of fields such as anatomy, and certainly for the context of today's discussion, gynecology as well, and others. So they become the bodies of knowledge production, essentially, for 19th century science and medicine. And Black feminists have reclaimed them as the foremothers of modern gynecology, and made particular note to name them, to give them a sense of their personhood, and to imagine their stories beyond just the detached writing of a medical 19th century medical physician. But how do we do that ethically has become an interesting consideration when we don't have their actual voices, when we only have representations of them from what their exploiter and left us. how do we make sense of that and how do we imagine it? So Black feminists have taken that that up in a number of different ways. One has been through art, where we can ethically sort of imagine their interior lives and what they may have thought or done, or how they may have resisted, or how they smiled, what brought them joy, outside of just the spectacle of pain and punishment. Um, and we imagine that the way we imagine ourselves, what makes us joyful or happy, how we do our hair, things like that, how we resist different kinds of institutional oppressions. Black feminists have done that in art in some very interesting ways. So my research looks at health humanities approaches, that is, approaches in the humanities and history, in women's and gender studies to an extent as an interdiscipline, but it sort of bridges the humanities and social sciences. How we've done that in art, representation, and culture. And I've written about this in several different places, including Disability Studies Quarterly, Humanities Journal. I did a piece actually most relevant to our discussion today, which was a comparative book review where I compared Medical Bondage to other works of art that came out in terms of Black women's poetic representations of this history. And so we can go to the next slide then, and I'm happy to share some of that work. These are three pieces that in the humanities piece that I did, I wanted to really give honor to and to analyze, because they're works of poetry. So this is, again, the cultural memory. How do we keep the women's legacies and lives going while challenging and pushing back against this, what we could call hagiography of Sims, which is just a big word for this belief that he was a medical saint of sorts, and he was depicted as such. I was astonished, even going into this history, knowing a little bit of, but knowing a lot about it before I even went in. When I looked in the archives, I knew he was famous. I didn't know how famous he was in the 19th century. He was internationally renowned. His medical brethren, his white medical brethren, mourned him tremendously. And you can look at the 19th century newspaper representations to see how they mourned Sims. They had to talk about this part of his life, though, that made him famous. And yet, this is after the Civil War, and we're starting to have to figure out, how are we going to talk about slavery? So he dies as a very famous man, heading the American Association of Medicine as president. He was knighted by various countries. He was world renowned, at least in Europe and in the U.S. And how they were going to treat and talk about that period of his life where he experimented on the enslaved women comes up in some interesting ways in 19th century newspaper memorializations of him. Now, what's missing there in a ghost-like way is the women. So it's very interesting as a historian to look at how they talked about Sims. They had to talk about his great discovery of medicine, but they managed to do so like almost doing jujitsu around mentioning the women, who Deirdre Cooper Owens tells us are the medical super bodies. So these super bodies that are like the every woman, and the contradiction of the fact that they were supposed to be all of these things in 19th century scientific race representations, all of these deplorable things, but at the same time, they're the bodies that give us that advanced human medical knowledge. So she highlights those contradictions. And so Black artists, Black women artists and poets, artists, portraitures, I mean, all kinds of art, but particularly I've focused on the poetry and the humanities piece, because I thought it was interesting how they tried to play with those specters, those ghosts in this history, how they tried to center the women whose stories we only know loosely in terms of life sketches, but how they wanted to center them as the foremothers of modern gynecology, and we could even say more broadly, modern medicine. And so I'll give you a sampling real quick before we move on. This comes from, there are three pieces. One is from Dominique Christina in her piece, Anarcha Speaks, her book, A History in Poems. So she's literally, they're imagining the voices of the women, but they're also juxtaposing them with our own 21st century historical time in relation to medical encounters for Black women in the 21st century, and depictions of pain and medical, they're doing a kind of medical storytelling as both historians and 21st century contemporary subjects. So then we have Koya Fagan Maples and her poem Mend, which I just love because it speaks to sort of the healing justice aspects of where Black feminism has tried to take this beyond the pain and trauma and toward a sense of reckoning and reclaiming and mending. And then we have another Black feminist health science studies collective member, Dr. Bettina Judd, who I interviewed for the Peace and Humanities, and her poem, her book, Patient Poems. So just very briefly, this is a very important piece. She starts with, the researcher discovers Anarcha Betsy Lucy. Nurses ask me, how much does it hurt on a scale from 1 to 10? Anarcha Westcott, Betsy Harris, and Lucy Zimmerman are taken into the care of a reluctant country surgeon in Montgomery, Alabama. See blood on a white hospital sheet. Tell me I'm having menstrual cramps. Betsy's first birth. Send me home with oxycodone, ibuprofen. Lucy, months out of household duties. After 5 hours in triage, Anarcha, his first vesico-vaginal fistula, and another prescription. In these three, Sims shapes his speculum, invents his silver sutures, perfects protocol for proper handling of the female pelvis. We wake, unanesthetized or addicted to opium, children born, children disappeared, helpless, help, brilliant. So what she's doing there is she's playing with time. And so the narration of what happened to the enslaved women is sort of juxtaposed in a real sense with the narrator's own experiences with contemporary medicine. And so you can see the women there very sort of there, ghost-like, in a way that is still haunting the American imagination, much like Toni Morrison's Beloved, in a sense. So that's how I talk about them, because I think that they were very important at doing the cultural work around moving and shifting the national discussion around this history and centering the women. And so it is this kind of Black feminist practice, I would say arguably, that has really helped to change and shift the medical, the political, and the cultural landscape of this country, including in medical curriculum design and training, and even in conversations such as the one we're having today, where we can have it now. I think that it was Black feminism that really helped to push that conversation forward. So we can go ahead one more slide, and then I'll say a couple more things before I shut up, and would love to open up to the discussion today. So this is a history best told visually in some respects. And so I've just pulled, there are numerous iconographic representations of this history, but I just pulled a few that sort of speak to Black women's work and Black women speaking back and pushing back against that saint-like representation of Sims. And so we can see that after years of a grassroots pointed effort, he has statues all over the country in several different states. He has an endowed professorship and fertility clinic in Ireland, and so on and so forth. And so these sites have become important sites for our cultural conversations. And so Black feminists have, and what we can say is Black communities and communities of color have pushed back against these representations, and we can frame that in Black feminist ways. So what we have here is the community to the community to inspire voices for change in Harlem led a 10-year effort to take down the statue of Sims, the monument that was situated in Central Park, which was that part of Central Park was in Harlem. After 10 years in 2018, they were successful and the statue was removed. The mayor ordered that the statue be removed. And then what to do with it is still a question that's up in the air. But right now it's in the cemetery where Sims was buried. And there was groundwork, like arts-based activism in front of the statue. There are some young people there who did this really important and powerful protest in front of the Sims statue, and they were symbolically dressed in patient what are those, patient robes or hospital gowns rather, and have depictions of blood coming out of their midsections and their reproductive parts. And so this becomes another way to raise public consciousness and to push back, to symbolically use that space and to reclaim that space in front of the Sims statue and to use it as a backdrop to sort of speak back to these histories. And so we have Michelle Broder, who has been just a tremendous force of nature in this history, particularly in the local history in Montgomery, Alabama. And we can return to that first image that I started with. She depicts what that image would look like if we were to reconceptualize it. So who is gazing at whom now? And so in that top center image, we see that we're looking back at Sims, who is nude, and that the women, 21st century women, have a chance to kind of speak back to that history. So it's very powerful, the role of art. And Broder also maintains, she's maintained now 2 conferences for Anarcha Lucy and Betsy about reckoning conferences. One I attended just last year. I think Dr. Cooper Owens was there as well speaking. And then she was able to secure funds with Black Girl Magic through grant-raised funds partly through the Southern Poverty Law Center to create and install the Mothers of Gynecology statues there in Montgomery, Alabama, just about a mile away from the State House in Montgomery, where there's also a statue of Sims. So what we can see is all of these efforts that have sort of trickled over time and amounted to this powerful pushback and sort of reframing of this history. So we can go on to the next slide. And that's going to be it for me, for my background and sort of how my work fits in with Dr. Cooper Owens' work here. But we were reading about Black women and Black women's experiences in slavery and medicine today for chapter 2. So I took the liberty of just pulling out some keywords there that can help to situate our conversation. And I'll be curious if others had ones that stuck out to them as well. Some of these already came up, so I'll be brief in going over them. But we're talking about the 19th century. So this happened from the mid to late sort of 1800s. And by 1870, Cooper Owens lets us know that gynecology had achieved its sort of professionalization status. But how it did that was through the contributions, unwillingly and unconsenting contributions of Black women. And she calls them bond women, which I think is a deliberate political choice with how to frame them, that they were enslaved, they were bonded. But the institutions of slavery and medicine were relied upon one another for their success, particularly after the end of the lawful end, the legal end of the Atlantic slave trade. Then it was upon the backs of Black women to reproduce the future generations of slaves, since there were no more being imported. So this the chapter speaks to the role of Black women's reproductive labor in the economy of slavery and the role of white medical men over time, wrestling that power from root medicine from Black nurses, from midwives. There's a shift in that power of who was attending to the bodies of Black women. And so this is, of course, caught up in the age of scientific racism and patriarchal ideologies about, constructions of difference as white colonial medicine would see it. And the exploitation and experimentation that took place, particularly with Black women. Cooper Owens uses some really interesting research methods to help us understand this. And so she looks at the history of law and court cases and social policies, and she turns to we don't have a lot of voices, but we do have the WPA slave narratives. So she turns to the slave narratives to see what formerly enslaved people were saying about doctors, their experiences with doctors. A lot of them were very fearful, and their experiences with exploitation and the trauma there that they experience and the experimentation. They were fearful of slave hospitals. Dr. Cooper Owens emphasizes. And Black women played a huge role in the professionalization of the field. And America becomes known internationally through these medical journals, publications about what happened in the use of enslaved women. We're known, the US is known all over the world, particularly in Europe and throughout North America. And they're known because of the use of Black women's bodies. So Cooper Owens helps us to understand Black women's experiences there and how they would have experienced all these shifts and changes. And so she looks at motherhood. And also, and this is a question that really cuts across a lot, but if there would have been any sense of agency and resistance there and how they may have done that, they may have gone to root medicine or midwives for abortions if they didn't want to have any other enslaved children. They may have done things if they did want children. So to look at the ways in which they may have been able to exercise agency even under the condition of bondage. But we do see that shift to white masculinized medical practice. And part of what that brings into play is that white male physicians had a front row seat to the sexual violence and sexual trauma that Black women were experiencing on the plantations, right? So they're responsible for their reproductive labor. But what comes with that? Of course, pregnancy comes with that, but then all of the other complications that would have gone along with that, sexually transmitted diseases, through sexual violence, white male sexual violence of Black women. This comes across very pointedly in the slave narratives that Cooper Owens offers us here. It also comes across in other written accounts that we have, the very few that we do have. The court case of Celia, a slave who killed her captor, who was repeatedly raping her, and she was actually killed as a result of that, and unable to really testify in court legally. But she says that, it basically did it in self-defense, but that wasn't, an allowable defense. Black women couldn't speak or testify in courts. Their voices weren't heard. So the minimization of that sexual violence, but the doctors played a big role there. We also see the discussion of sexual violence in Harriet Jacobs' slave narrative, for example. So just to make it real, this was a horrific threat, the threat of sexual terrorism as a part of the condition of being in bondage for Black women. Then we have the issue of pain that comes up, that continues to resonate with us in the level of insensitivity and medical bias in relation to the beliefs that still have a stronghold on us today in many senses. The beliefs that were used to justify slavery was the justification that Black people felt pain differently or didn't feel pain the same. For some reason, this continues to have a stronghold even in medical training now. And it plays out in different kinds of research that folks have done. And so then we have the issue of consent and ethics. And all of this brings us to, not being able to consent in the context of bondage. But even in that time, slaves knew this was wrong. Other folks knew this was wrong. So how does that conversation about ethics take place both in the 19th century and as well as how we look at it in the 21st century? Cooper Owens helps us to situate that as well in this chapter. And she just does a great job of helping us understand more explicitly how Black women's bodies and lives were used in relation to medical knowledge production. So with that, I can shut up now and invite others to jump in with what may have stuck out to them as well. Thank you so much, Jalise, for
Thank you.
Taking care of that.
No worries, and thank you so much. That was great framing for our conversation today. So to kick things off, if anyone wants to come off mute, turn your video on if you'd like, and just kind of give us your overarching thoughts about this chapter, any kind of questions, comments, or thoughts that might have been provoked by Dr. Dudley's, fantastic overview of the chapter and her research.
Yeah, I'm curious what stuck out to others. There's so much here. She gives us so much to work with.
If I may, from the translational science kind of clinical research side of things, when you mention consent and ethics, that being a theme, I just think about, even today, some of the articles and even in like stat news and publications like that, where we see that some of this is still going on today in just different forms. Are there any examples that come to mind from you, Dr. Dudley, or anyone in the room of kind of some more recent things that parallel what went on during times of enslavement? And what are some things when we're putting on our solutions hat that we can do to try to influence change, whether that's policy? There was a couple questions in there, but what are your thoughts, Dr. Dudley? I see you shaking your head, so I think there might be something there.
That's good. I mean, some of my research has been on this space, like the slave hospital, as a space of isolated confinement, right? So these women were taken from their surrounding communities. They were sent to the Sims hospital. Of course, Dr. Cooper Owens doesn't just talk about Sims, but I'm kind of using that as a stand-in here. And so this space of isolation, these institutions of isolation, where consent is still an issue at play, where we have issues of power and powerlessness still at play, and where we have access to the reproduction of women of color. I think the prison is certainly one of those areas, and we have some alarming stories. So again, not saying this is like slavery, right? I want to be clear about that thread, but that we can see the remnants of colonial times in neo-colonial times through the lack of consent in sterilizations that are going on in prisons right now, impacting largely Black and Latina people and BIPOC communities. Certainly Indigenous folks have also dealt with sterilization abuse. That's still ongoing in recent. So I think this history helps us to think about like who's vulnerable in those spaces and how these different institutions connect. A lot of times it's with people who can't consent either because English is not their first language, or they don't know what they've consented to because it hasn't been properly explained to them. And so this is, if we push it to the furthest out extremes, it's a kind of eugenics where you're saying, poor imprisoned women of color should not reproduce. And so we're going to see to it that they don't. And so there's been a couple alarming cases of that out in California and other places that have been publicized. So that's the first thing that comes to mind, at least when you ask that question for me.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Any other thoughts, even if it's not related to the question that was posed?
I think when she talks about like the economic and like the economic part of it, right? About how the slave owners, holders, or whatever you call them, were often like that intertwining of like that health and reproductive capabilities of enslaved women, right? So when you talk about those medical practices that they use to ensure that labor and that reproductive, that capacity of the enslaved women to benefit that slave economy, because without those women constantly reproducing, and you might as well say producing more slaves for them, you know, that whole economic interest of it that she highlights in the book is interesting. And I never really thought about it that way. And she explained it last week too, when she talked about that as well, but just the whole economic part of it, of mass reproduction. Just like when you talk about it, Dr. Dudley, when you go back to mass incarceration, right? So we can't have a lot of things we won't have unless, you know, prisoners are creating and doing in the prisons for different companies as far as that mass production as well. So the whole economic part of it is interesting.
Definitely. And I'm just looking here at page 66, where she's talking about the WPA, like about halfway down, she's talking about the WPA slave narratives. And one of the sources she looks at, the slave narratives, slave management journals, contain numerous accounts linking economic growth, pregnancy rates, and medicine. So just exactly what you said of how closely physicians were. You know, I think that was surprising to me coming into this research. It's how big a role these physicians played in the economic system of the institution of slavery, and how central Black women's bodies were to that whole process.
I would agree with Tanisha. You know, you hear for years about the slave masters and the enslaved women being forced to have sex. And I don't know why, but, you know, you think about it as more of they were just a convenience for them to pleasure themselves. They had these captive audiences, but to then think about that it was an opportunity for them to repopulate their plantations.
Right.
And that they could divorce themselves from the humanity of what is their own child to just have another body to put out in the field.
Sure. And yeah, that's an interesting point there. Dr. Cooper Owens and I agree on this point. Other historians don't, but I came across, and apparently she came across, we're so limited at like what sources we can use in slavery. So that's why we turn to the slave narratives, or we have to imagine in art and stuff. But there's an 1850 census that mentions James Marion Sims, and then Black people were not mentioned by name then. They were mentioned by color, which was either B or M, okay? And then age and gender. That was it. It took me 3 years of staring at this document before I realized that there was a baby that was born marked M in 1851 that was listed as the quote unquote property of James Marion Sims. So this raises a very interesting question about whose baby was this? You know that there's a Horton Spillers is a scholar in slavery and Black psychoanalysis, and she says, "Mama's baby, Papa's maybe." Now we don't know who it was, and we know that Black comes in all hues. But Dr. Cooper Owens and I certainly think that we want to know, you know, whose baby that could have been, given the access that all of these physicians, these white male physicians, had to their bodies. But that's speculative, and you know, it's one way to read the history. But that brings also to mind the impact on the Black family structure. And Cooper Owens talks about how everybody was in this mixture, you know, the white physicians, the plantation owners, the Black women with no consent or control. What about Black men? They had no ability, you know, to step in or aid or any control or say over how their bodies would be used either in this process. And so I think that is interesting to talk about the continuing impact on Black families as well that may be stemming from that kind of separation and trauma. You know what though? And I'm looking at time, and I've been teaching about this and talking about this for so long. It surprises people when I say how hopeful and optimistic I am and how inspired I am by this story, because I think it's been successful in the sense of taking this dark history. Then we have folks like Dr. Cooper Owens, who provides us a much more nuanced, like we'll call it historiography. Then we have folks like the folks up in Harlem who staged a 10-year campaign, you know, grassroots community activism. And then the young people who did the public art protest in front of the statue. And that body ecology also did something similar years prior. Then we have all of this brilliant poetry and highly awarded, decorated poetry that comes out. Then we have in 2020, The Reckoning with George Floyd and Breonna Taylor brings to light, oh, we better do something. We better say something about this. So we have the American College of Obstetrics and Gynecology, which releases a statement talking about how, you know, prioritizing health equity and prioritizing naming the women and giving them their credit as the foremothers of modern gynecology. Then we have, you can look left, right, and center, and you see it pop up everywhere in cultural spaces when you start to look for it. It's been, I would argue that it has been a successful campaign of Black feminism, like a sustained effort over time, working in all these different areas of law. And here I am over here in my little corner, and in medical history and in anesthesiology, across disciplines, and in art, and all of these places. And then I like to end on this powerful note of what Michelle Broder was able to do with erecting that statue. And it was just a way to say, no, not on our watch. And we're going to reclaim, push back, and sort of see what kind of meaning making can come about if we view this history through Black feminist and BIPOC-centered perspectives. To me, that's a powerful story. And to me, that is a story about reclamation. Dare we say reparations, or do we have time to talk? It certainly can make the case for reparations. It certainly can. And that's part of the work I'll do in the future. But, and healing justice, I think. So I do feel it remarkably very, very hopeful and inspired by Dr. Cooper Owens' work and the other work in Black feminist perspectives that have come up in response.
I think to your point, Dr. Dudley, it broadens the lens and the perspective when we say her name. You know, you bring up Breonna Taylor, and we think about Sandra Bland and so many others that we've said their names because of the violence that they've endured. And it has brought such a heightened awareness. And now we have Anarka and Betsy and Lucy, and we can say their names. You know, we went for so long, when we look at the mistrust of the medical systems and the institutions, and we could all talk about Tuskegee. Yeah. And then suddenly we could also, why did her name just totally go out of my brain? Henrietta Lacks. We could talk about Henrietta Lacks. And then all of a sudden, this whole story about J. Marion Sims starts to come to light. and we hear how horrific that was, but now we have names that we can associate with it and put humanity to the victims.
Oh, that's so important. Yes. Thank you so much for saying that. It calls to mind a lot. I don't know about for others, but linking it to Say Her Name, which, you know, Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw sort of started that movement. The naming part, though, is challenging, right? Because scholars like Dr. Judd and I originally were saying in certain, you know, naming conventions, Western naming conventions of slavery, the enslaved bondspeople would be assumed to be given the last name of their captors, basically. In that reading, Dr. Judd and I did the research to find out exactly who these people were. And so the last names were Westcott, so on and so forth, Zimmerman, and Harris. So that's one interpretation, but that requires some mind trickery around accepting the fact that we would accept that the names of their last names of their captors are actually theirs. There has been some recent, really recent, actually this year, historical scholarship. A gentleman named last name Halleman, he found, y'all, he found Anarcha's grave, because the question was always what happened to her after. And I'm delighted to tell you, with just 8 minutes left, that she died after the abolition of slavery. So though we don't know the conditions of her life, she died just about 4 or 5 years after the abolition of slavery. So she saw the end of slavery, and she died buried next to her husband, who last name was Jackson. So we have then Anarcha Jackson, and we know that she knew love, and we know that she made it to the end of slavery. She was at least able to see the end of slavery, at least in the legal sense. We don't know what the legal abolition of slavery. So that also is some recent historical news that brings me joy when I think about this history.
Have you been able to read Say Anarcha by Jesse? I can't think of his last name.
Yeah, that's what I was just talking about, because I came across his work through the conference, the Anarcha Lucy Betsy conference. And he was speaking, and it just came out in 2023. That's part of his major finding. He did a deep dive on what would have happened to her after, right? Because the common narrative, or is it was 1849, and then Sims developed the cure, so on and so forth, and then they fall out of history. And he said, what if we can follow them further? So he thinks that she actually ended up in New York, where she continued to be experimented on by Sims, but then she went back to the South, and he found where she probably would have been buried. And the spelling of her name was a little bit different there than it was in Sims depictions. So yeah, he did a great job with you got to be dogged and and trying to find us through these voids and absences. But that he added a lot to the conversation with that.
His story about going and finding the grave was wild, just how close he was to not finding it, how.
Yeah, it really was. He did a great job with that treatment, and relied along just the local knowers of the history that just kind of passed it on. The living historians down there in Montgomery, or down there in the South. This was in North Carolina, I think, where she ended up.
Yeah, North Carolina, Virginia, I can't remember, somewhere.
Yeah. So that's a great piece. And so we can see how, so I've got a couple new pieces coming out. So 1985, I talked about as a starting point for Black feminism and Black feminist perspectives in this area, in scholarship and also in grassroots activism. And then, each point along the way, we continue to add more to the discussion. So Holloman's piece is the latest that really has added a lot. I'm working on a book that will basically, in a nutshell version, say everything I just said. But it will center the theme of the role of Black feminism, which I don't want to underestimate in this. Black feminism, cultural memory, and the foremothers of modern gynecology. So I'm working on that one, and I'm working on a piece, workshop and a piece with Medical Anthropology Quarterly, which will talk about that 40 years of Black feminist scholarship and activism, grassroots activism that came out of this, so that we can really make sure to note, how significant those approaches have been in terms of changing our political, cultural, and public health landscapes in this country.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Dudley. We appreciate you and the work that you're doing and just everything, really. And love that you use the word hope in relation to all of this work, because, in today's world and tomorrow's world and yesterday's world, we can all use a little more hope. And as we look toward next week, we will be hearing from Aisha Bell Hardaway. She's the co-director of the Social Justice Institute, associate professor of law, and director of the Social Justice Law Center at the Case Western Reserve University School of Law. We'll be talking about Chapter 3, Contested Relations, Slavery, Sex, and Medicine. And we hope you all will join us. Thank you again, Dr. Dudley, and everyone have a fantastic afternoon.
Thank you so much for putting this together. This is a fabulous idea. I'm so delighted that you let me be a part of it. And it was so good to connect with the folks who could join as well.
Thank you. And I'm sorry I'm going to miss next week.
That's okay. We'll record it and send it around.
All right. Thank you.
All right.
Take care.
Bye, Heidi.
Bye.
Bye.